Good morning, everyone. My name is Sue. On behalf of the Goochland branch of the Pamunkey Regional Library, welcome to today's program, Ornamental Pollinator Gardens. This presentation is part of the 2023 horticultural series developed in a partnership between the library and the Goochland Powhatan Master Gardener Association. Representing the Master Gardeners today, we have Audrey Hirsch, who is a Goochland Powhatan Master Gardener Association volunteer, and today's presenter, Kathy McCarthy, who is also a Goochland Powhatan Master Gardeners Association volunteer. Kathy settled in the Richmond area after completing graduate studies at the University of Virginia and began learning about the joys of gardening in clay soils. Her newspaper articles and speaking engagements typically focus on sustainable gardening topics. Today, she will focus on how to meld the idea of supporting pollinators with the joy of a beautiful ornamental landscape. Okay, let's get started. The chat feature is available. Please send us your questions. Kathy will be addressing them throughout the presentation at certain breaking points. So here is Kathy McCarthy.
Welcome, everyone. I am so glad to be here today to talk to you about pollinator gardens and the possibilities that are there. As Susan said, we're going to have points in the presentation where I will pause and we will answer some questions. So please put those into the chat box when you get a chance. And then the other thing I will let you know in advance, because sometimes when I surprise people with this, you might get a dirty look or two, is at the end, if we have time, we're going to go between 45 minutes and an hour today. But if we have time at the end, I would love to crowdsource some ideas around native plants that you guys have had really good experiences with. So at the end, if you have a favorite native plant that you've had a good experience growing, I would love for you to share that. So I tell you that in advance, so I don't spring that on you. But this particular talk is about ornamental pollinator gardens, and I say that's not an oxymoron because I believe that you can be highly ornamental and pamper your pollinators at the same time. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Let's see. First, I have two plugs. One, as Susan stated, Audrey and I are both from the Master Gardener Association in Goochland Powhatan. There are probably other folks on the call who are also. If you are not a current Master Gardener and you have any interest in volunteering, the Extension Service would love to have you. So we do training once a year. And if you're interested, the applications for training typically go in September, October. So if you want to put that down on your calendar as something to explore, we always love to welcome more volunteers. The second thing I'm going to plug is a event, our signature event that we run once a year in Goochland County. The Spring Garden Fest. This is our 17th year. It is absolutely free. Sometimes there's some confusion about the fact that there is a registration fee if you want to take classes. But if you don't want to take classes, if you just want to come and have a delightful time with a band and a food truck and shop for some gardening items and some plants, it's free parking, free admission. Please just come out and shop to your heart's delight. If you are interested in classes, the class registration just opened up at gpmga.net or .org. Both of them will redirect you to the right place. And that registration just opened on January 9th. So if you are interested, class selection is really wide open right now. As we get into February, March, classes will fill up and there'll be less selection. So if you're interested, please go to gpmga.net and go ahead and register for a full day of classes for a fairly bargain fee of $35. Okay, so now let's talk about our topic of interest for today. which is pollinator gardens and ornamental pollinator gardens specifically. So this is an outline of what we're going to talk about today, so you kind of know how we're making progress. First, we're going to compare and contrast traditional ornamental gardens versus pollinator gardens. We're going to talk specifically about what are those ornamental garden design principles. And so how would you know if you were, following those traditional principles? And then we're going to talk about pollinator garden design, kind of the whys and also the whats. And then I'm going to build my case for why you can have both. And then we're going to switch gears. So the first half of the presentation is really about the concepts of ornamental garden design and pollinator garden design. And the second half is about the implementation and how you make it happen in your own yard. Second to last, we're going to talk about upping your game. So the first, initially I want to talk about anyone can do this, and I don't want to make this sound hard, and I want everyone to take at least the first step. But then we will spend just a little bit of time at the end talking about kind of that next level of pollinator gardening. And if you want a little bit more of a challenge, what are some things that you could do to kind of up your game? Okay, so let's get started. So this is a picture of a spice bush swallowtail on a phlox plant in my backyard. And I love seeing butterflies in my backyard, and it is, I think, easy to do. But the way this talk got started, the reason why I put this together is because I really do think that confusion abounds. So I was having a discussion with someone at a volunteer event. I was sitting in a booth and someone came up and said, oh, pollinator gardens, I think they're fantastic, but my HOA won't allow me to have a pollinator garden. And I thought, how would it be possible that your homeowners association wouldn't allow you to have a pollinator garden? That just doesn't sound logical to me. So she said, oh, it's right in our HOA guidelines. And so she pulled it up on her phone and she handed me her phone. This was pre-COVID, so we could touch each other's phones. And I looked at the phone and it said, landscaping must be appropriate to the architecture of the home and be suitably tidy. And I thought, I just don't see anything in that sentence that says you can't have a pollinator garden. I just didn't read that. And that, as I spoke more with this woman, I really understood better that she had been under the understanding that a pollinator garden equals an unkempt landscape, right? So a pollinator garden, the only way you can support pollinators is if you have a vast meadow that you never mow. And it's amazing if you do have the land and the ability to have a meadow garden. I think that's a wonderful thing to have, but many people have a quarter acre in a suburban neighborhood, or sometimes less than that, or they have HOA guidelines or whatever the case may be, and they can't have that ideal meadow landscape. And I would argue that pollinator gardening, especially if you're in a suburban area where there are a lot of neo-colonials. In Richmond architecture, there's a lot of neo-colonials, and I think that a pollinator garden is absolutely appropriate to the architecture of that home. And so that's how this talk got started, because I really want to spread the word that you can support pollinators even if you can't achieve the ideal of a beautiful, prairie landscape or meadow landscape. So let's transition. Let's talk about what is ornamental garden design, right? So if you're dealing with an HOA, they're saying your garden needs to be ornamental. What does that even mean? This is a picture I use in a couple of talks because I love it. It is Mount Stewart. It's in County Down in Ireland. And I don't think anyone would argue that this garden is not ornamental, right? It's beautiful. And I think that there are lots of books and resources that you can use to better understand sort of the many attributes of an ornamental landscape. Hardscape, how do you do your hardscape? How do you do your entrance design, that kind of thing. What I'm going to focus on today is plant selection. And I would argue that there are some common principles that are threaded throughout much of ornamental garden design throughout history. So if you really think about ornamental garden design, it's been going on for a long time, right? So Rome and Babylonia are known to have had vast ornamental gardenscapes throughout their cities as well as their countrysides. We really can't go to the gardens of Babylonia at this point in time, but there are gardens in existence, ornamental gardens in existence, that you could go visit today that were designed and built starting in the 9th century. So the Alhambra in Granada was begun in the 9th century. The design was really complete in the 14th century. And that is a garden you can go visit today if you so choose. And that tradition of really thinking about gardens as something that ornaments a piece of architecture or, pleases the eye to people has continued down through the centuries. So you have the Villa d'Este in the 16th century and that whole Italian garden tradition. You move into France in the 17th century and Versailles, and it continues here in the US. Bartram's Garden was begun in Philadelphia in the 1720s. You have the gardens in Charleston, and then you have more modern gardens. So Dumbarton Oaks in 1920 and the High Line, which was built in New York City in 1999. And you might look at all of these gardens and you might say, okay, Mount Vernon and the High Line have nothing in common, except they're both American. But I would argue that they do have things in common, that they follow 5 or 6 principles that you would see in any of these gardens as good ornamental design. And here's my case for that. So I would say throughout all of those gardens, 800 years of garden design, you're going to see that they don't plant onesie-twosie, right? So this best practice is that you want to have that feeling of abundance. Aesthetically, you want that feeling of abundance. And functionally, of course, you want to be able to bring bouquets inside. And the aesthetics are supported. They've done studies, psychological studies, that have looked at our lizard brains, right? So human beings want to see abundance in their gardens and in their plantings because thousands of years ago, scarcity meant that you were going to starve, right? So you wanted to see abundance in your plantings. And ornamentally, it gives you psychologically a positive feeling. Also within ornamental gardens, you want to plant for color throughout the season, right? So unless you have a vacation home in Maine and you're only there for the month of July, you want to see color throughout the seasons. You also want to have winter interest, right? So if your garden is completely herbaceous, nothing left standing in the winter, that's a very flat landscape. So aesthetically, you want to leave some material. Also, you want to reduce your maintenance, right? And you want your plants to survive. So even in an ornamental garden, you really want to think about right plant, right place, so that you're not creating an issue in your garden. The tapestry effect, really planting different shapes and heights, ornamentally, it creates a blending and a layered effect. And again, psychologically, people view nature as multiple layers. So when you create that tapestry effect, again, it's very pleasing to the eye. And then finally, if you are just looking at a garden from an ornamental standpoint, having a repetition of plants and colors creates a bigger impact. So you don't have a disjointed effect of spots and dots. You have more of a cohesive design. So these are ornamental design principles that I would argue, again, are found in all of those gardens over 800 years. And that consistency creates a real feel for what principles you might want to follow if you were only designing for ornamental effect. But again, the point of today's presentation is to say that you can have an ornamental garden which is extremely supportive of pollinators. That is, my favorite phrase, that pampers your pollinators, right? And so what I want to start with is really thinking through why we design for pollinators. And it's a little facetious because I don't think you would have signed up for this talk if you weren't in support of pollinators, but I always like to baseline it with why. Why are we even doing this? And this is a buckeye in my backyard. It's also a very common butterfly in Virginia. And I couldn't have a garden that didn't have buckeyes in them because they're one of my favorites. Okay, so why do we design for pollinators? This is a fritillary, and if you know whether it's a great spangled or an Aphrodite, I would appreciate your input. But it's again a beautiful butterfly. So I'm not going to overdo this. I think we're all preacher and chorus on designing for pollinators, but just some basic principles. Even if you are talking to someone who intuitively does not support pollinator design, I think any human being would support having food, right? And so 87% of our plants are pollinated by insects. Only 13% of our plants are wind pollinated. So of course we want to support pollinators so that we can have food to eat. I did have one gentleman at a talk who came up to me one time and said he was on I don't know if it's the Atkins or the keto diet. He was on a diet that focused on protein. So he wasn't too worried about plants. And I said, well, sir, I think that cows eat plants. And so we still want to have a lot of plants so that you can have your food as well. So that's definitely one reason to support pollinators. Another reason to plant native plants and to support pollinator gardening is if you are in support of birds, right? So this is the information from Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but clearly, if you want to support birds, you need to have caterpillars, and the way that you have caterpillars is you plant native plants. So just to reiterate one more reason. And then I like this reason because this sometimes doesn't come up. The information about supplying caterpillars for birds, I think, comes up typically, but there have been studies about home values. So there was a real estate study in 2006 that showed that a home with a well-kept blooming landscape would increase the sales price of comparable homes by 10%. So I took this information and I said, if a home is worth $300,000 and landscaping it is going to increase its value by 10%, that means that that gardener has $30,000 to spend on plants. So they can tell their spouse every time they go to the garden center that they have $30,000 in budget. But you can see how that goes over with your spouse and tell me how it goes. So those are reasons why you would want to design for pollinators. But I want to circle back to how you can have an ornamental garden and a pollinator garden at the same time. So we went through the ornamental principles. And if you think about designing for pollinators, my thesis, my argument is it's one and the same. And so every HOA should support this. So let's talk about what those principles are, right? So in ornamental best practices, we talked about not planting onesie twosie, right? If you talk about pollinator best practices, you want to plant in broad swaths. So at least 5 to 7 plants together. And why do you want to do that? Many of you know these reasons, right? But 30% of native bees are host plant specialists, but all native bees practice bloom consistency, right? So once they start collecting nectar and pollen, they want to continue on in the same plant. And the research seems to indicate that it's an efficiency trigger, right? So if they have to change the actions or change their approach to nectaring and pollen gathering, it is inefficient for them. And being efficient means that your survival rate is going to go up. So all bees are looking for bloom consistency. And the way that they do that is they look for large swaths of the same bloom. And so there's a research paper in Hort Technology. It's in the resources, which the resources page, Susan says she's going to post it on Monday. But if you want to go read the actual research, you're welcome to. The overall statement is that you really need about 10 square feet of a native plant bloom to be most attractive to particular types of pollinators, bees as well as butterflies, because that grabs their attention. When they see something that's about 10 square feet, so that could be 2 feet by 5 feet, it could be 3 feet by 3 feet. Again, if you're planting 5 to 7 plants, you're probably going to get that amount of square area for many plants, but that attracts their attention. So what they did in this study is they looked at if you just have 1 or 2 square feet of goldenrod, or do you have, which would be hard to do because it's a very boisterous plant. But anyway, 1 to 2 square feet of a particular type of plant, or you again have that 9 to 10 square feet, and it attracted pollinators. The larger section of plant attracted pollinators at a much greater rate. And that's because, again, they're looking for that efficiency of pollen collection and nectar collection. And that matches exactly with the ornamental best practice, right? You want to plant with abundance to create that psychological feel and pleasing effect to the eye. And you want to plant in broad swaths for the pollinators. So it's an exact match. Okay, second principle, the ornamental best practice was plant for color throughout the season. So as you know, pollinators also need color throughout the season, right? They need to be able to collect pollen and nectar throughout the season. And one of the components of that is, you know, a mother bumblebee comes out, or the queen bumblebee comes out in April. She's collecting pollen and nectar for her larva that she'll be producing. She will scan to establish where she wants to build her nest. And once she decides in a particular area, she wants to be within 160 feet, really, of the nectar source and the pollen source. Now, there, many of you who are really have deep knowledge about bees, I'm sure there are different types of bees and different radiuses that they will use, etc. So this is just an example, but in this example, once she's established this is where she wants to build her nest, she doesn't have, you know, transportation to go a mile away. She can't go to the grocery store in Short Pump. Once she's established her nest, she really needs that nectar and pollen base to be consistent throughout the seasons. And we're so lucky. In Virginia, we can have nectar and pollen sources blooming really from April all the way through the end of October. And we'll talk about that in the implementation phase of this talk. But we're in such a really delightful part of the country as far as our opportunity to have blooms, you know, for 6 months. But you really need to keep it consistent because, again, if you've drawn her in April, you need to feed her and all of her babies all the way through until the end of the season. Inconsistent bloom, you know, means your pollinators are going to starve. So, but that matches exactly, right, with the ornamental principle of color throughout the season. So you've got this match. Ornamentally, we said don't forget about winter interest. Again, with the pollinators, winter interest translates into you want to leave that plant material standing and you want to leave your leaf litter available to the pollinators, right? So there's the cavity dwelling bees will go ahead and overwinter. Some of the bee larvae overwinters in your hollow stems. So leaving your herbaceous material up so that the larva that's in the stems can go ahead and overwinter is very positive. There are a number of different butterfly species here in Virginia that overwinter in their chrysalis. So they attach to woody material and then they stay in that material over winter, as well as some of our pollinators are down in the leaf litter. And of course your birds want to go ahead and collect seed. So you don't want to take that seed away. You want to leave that plant material up. So to continue on with my argument to you here, ornamental best practices of right plant in the right place. So native plants are built to thrive, but they are also built to support the reproduction and to create the food webs that we need in our gardens, right? So native plants specifically are the hosts for many of our pollinators. And again, there is a resource page that'll be posted on Monday. And the back page of it, I'm sure you all can read this over Zoom, just so that you know it exists, that lists out the host plants that you could plant in your garden that will typically be happy in a Virginia garden, and then the pollinators that they support. So, you know, these plants have co-evolved, and so the insects have mouth parts and approaches to digesting that plant material that has co-evolved for thousands of years. And many of these plants are highly ornamental. So again, you get both of those components. There's also a reference on your handout sheet to a study that Emily Basin did. It's from Hort Technology in 2018. There's a link on the resource sheet and you can go look up the study if you want to. The overall finding, it looks at cultivars of native plants, nativars, and on a data level with, you know, supporting data rather than sort of vague discussions. She talks about nativars and how they could support our native food webs. And so I always refer to that article because it, again, I like to be more research focused and data focused than sort of hypothetical. So that'll be there for you on Monday. Okay. Ornamentally, the fifth principle was different shapes and heights to support plants and blooms. One of the things that you look at from a pollinator gardening perspective is, again, supporting flower shapes and heights of different pollinators, because you have long-tongue bees, you have short-tongue bees, right? So your flower shape is going to support different types of bees. And then also, there are different flight heights that are preferred by different pollinators, right? So zebra swallowtails prefer to fly at a lower height or a lower altitude, I guess you could call it, although it's measured in feet. So they like to be at lower heights than other types of butterflies or other types of bees. So by creating that variety in your garden, you're really supporting a diversity of pollinators. And then final ornamental principle, repetition of plants and colors creates cohesiveness. It's also very important for pollinator garden design, right? So by creating that repetition of plant types, you can create multiple nesting zones, right? Because they can get to the plant that they need to nectar or collect pollen from multiple locations in your yard. Another thing to think about is just creating less competition. So one of the things that I found with Monarda is, or bee balm, is it draws in quite a few hummingbirds. Well, hummingbirds are incredibly territorial. So if you just have one patch of Monarda, what you're creating is sort of a competitive environment. If you can create several patches of Monarda, there's an opportunity for several hummingbirds to nectar without coming into direct conflict. So, you know, I think that it supports the ornamental component. It's beautiful to see that repetition of color throughout your landscape. And it also supports your pollinator communities. So just something to think about. So that was my thesis, right? That you can create an ornamental pollinator garden, that is possible, and that you shouldn't feel like it, you know, only a meadow will do. You can have other types of garden design and still be pollinator friendly. We're going to move into the second half of the presentation and really start talking about implementation rather than just the concepts. And I'd like to take a pause at this point, just in case there are any questions or any comments. I mean, if you want to share something that you think would be helpful to the group, that would be great as well.
Kathy, so far nothing in the chat box.
Okay.
We can go ahead and put your comments or questions in the chat box and we can review them. Thanks.
Okay, great. And again, at the end, I would like to crowdsource best ornamental native plants. So just, you know, scratch one down if you get a chance. Okay, so if you agree with me, if I sold you on the ornamental garden also being a pollinator garden, then we start to talk about how do you implement that. And we can keep it very, very simple. Like I said, towards the end, we'll talk about, you know, upping your game and other things you can do. But I'm going to start out with 3 extremely simple examples because I think it's important to take the first step. So here's an example of a very low maintenance, very low key set of plants that you could place in your landscape, and you would have 6 months of bloom. So you would be able to support pollinators across from April all the way to September. Again, we're very lucky in Virginia. We do have hundreds and hundreds of native plants that are ornamental and available to our pollinators. Not every area of the country has that, but you don't have to get complicated. I mean, you can use some very simple plant choices and really have that consistency of bloom across the season. So I'm going to talk for a few seconds about why these plants. So why would you, Cercis canadensis is redbud. Phlox, I've represented several different species of phlox here, and we'll talk a lot more about phlox in a minute. It's one of my favorite plants. Baptisia, and then Asclepsia species, those are your milkweeds. Echinacea, also called purple coneflower. Well, there's other types of coneflowers, but I focus on purple coneflower. Monarda, there's a couple types of Monarda here. I've represented Didyma and Fistulosa. And then Eupatorium, which has now been changed by the botanist to Eucotrium. Anyway, Joe Pye weed, okay? So why these plants? I personally like to have plants that are easy to grow. I want them to, I believe in independence. They should be taking care of themselves, not me out there laboring too hard. And they also should have function, right? So they should support our local pollinators. I think you can be pretty and substantial. It's what I tell my children. You can be attractive and, you know, be hardworking and have brains. And so these plants do that. This is a picture in my backyard of Baptisia sparkling sapphires. It's a Baptisia australis. Someone correct me on that. Nativar. It's a cultivar, and bumblebees are really one of the pollinators that very much enjoy it because it's the flower shape. Their weight actually weighs down the flower shape, opens it up, and allows them to get to the pollen, versus the smaller pollinators aren't as heavy. So they can't open the flowers as much. So, but this one is extremely popular with bumblebees. But let's talk about these plants in general. Again, you're trying to plant in large swaths. This is an example of the plants that were on that chart in a way that I like, but you don't have to plant them this way. You might not want, purple next to red next to pink. That might not be your color choice. And that's fine. This is just, something that brings me delight in my backyard. So you have your phlox, your monarda, and your echinacea. And all of those are providing nectar and pollen to your pollinators. Why echinacea specifically? It is, I think, one of the hardest working plants in show business. You can see here, it supports a number of different types of pollinators. So bees adore it. This bee was sleeping in my backyard. He was enjoying echinacea so much, just passed out. But you also have many types of butterflies who can nectar from echinacea. You have an American lady there, a fritillary. This requires no care on my part. I do not pinch it. I do not deadhead it. I do not stake it. It's just a very hardworking plant. Why Joe Pye weed? Again, when I go out in my backyard and I see this many tiger swallowtails on any plant, I want to plant it over and over again. And Joe Pye weed is extremely self-sufficient. Many of the roads in Goochland County, as you drive down and you look in the ditches, these are plants that are growing in the ditches. So again, that meets my standard of a plant that I don't have to babysit, which is providing support to our pollinators. Okay, so that was one example. That was some very easy to care for plants. Here's another example. I do a talk on Virginia horticultural history, and it talks about plants that are named after Virginia, right? So even if you constrain yourself to plants that are named after Virginia, you can have bloom from April all the way through. And there's actually a missing plant on here, which is witch hazel, which is Hamamelis virginica, which would bloom in September and October. So I apologize. You can definitely get all the way through to October with Virginia named plants blooming. But this starts out with bluebells, right? Mertensia virginica moves into spring beauty, which is Claytonia virginica. Then you have fringe tree. That's the Cheonanthus virginicus, which is a great substitute for Bradford pear, which is highly invasive. So pull out all your Bradford pears and please plant fringe tree. Itea virginica, that's just a gorgeous plant throughout the year. The fall foliage can be just phenomenal. Tradescantia virginia, so that's your spiderwort, and it's, my understanding, I don't grow it, but my understanding is it just blooms and blooms and blooms. Sweet bay, so Magnolia virginiana. Then you've got your late summer bloom from your sweet bay. And then one of my personal favorite, Culver's root. So Veronicastrum virginica, that's going to also take you through late summer. And I have had some bloom from that in September, and that is a bee magnet. Observationally, that is very popular. Excuse me. So those plants are all named after Virginia. So you know that they are definitely native here. One thing I do recommend, and you may have already done this, but it's on your resources sheet. I recommend that you visit a website called virginiaplantatlas.org. This is a screenshot from their website. And so it's vaplantatlas.org. And they have done the hard work, bless their hearts, of taking all of the native plants that are native to Virginia and actually getting it down to a county level, right? So this is, you type in a plant name, this is bluebells, Mertensia virginica, and it will show you which counties in Virginia it is native to. And so I would encourage you, as you're picking native plants, again, our pollinators have co-evolved with local plant fauna, fauna and flora go together. And therefore, if you can pick native plants that are at least East Coast native, it's very helpful because they're going to be set up to be more likely to be host plants, more likely for our local pollinators to be able to use them. But if you want to get really nerdy about it and get down to plants that are native to your county, you can go to this website and get that information. So I'll go quickly through these. I bet these are plants that many of you might already be growing. But again, it's just to demonstrate you can do something as simple as just pick 6, 7, 8 plants and you can support that whole season. So Virginia bluebells, these are gorgeous. This information, as far as the horticultural information on how to grow them, also on your resources sheet, I recommend the Missouri Botanical Garden site. Many of you might already use that. It's mobot, MOBOT.org. And when you go to their site and you enter in a plant, it gives you lots of good information about growing the plant. So as I skip through these slides, you can go to the Missouri site and all this information plus much, much more will be there. So don't feel like you need to, desperately write this all down. This is fringe tree, which I mentioned before, is such a great spring flowering plant. It tolerates black walnuts. So that is a plus unto itself. Then you have, of course, sweet spire. Again, I talked a little bit about the fall color can be outstanding. So if you're looking for something to replace burning bush, which is a terrible invasive, this has great fall color. We talked a little bit about spiderwort and how it's a workhorse and will bloom and bloom for you. And then sweet bay. Sweet bay you can grow as a shrub. You can also limb it up and potentially grow it as a small specimen tree. So I've seen a demonstration of that in someone's garden where they limbed it up and it became a small ornamental tree, and it was beautiful. And then Culver's root. Again, this is one of my favorites. I grow 4 different cultivars of this in my garden, and it stands on its own. You do not need to stake it or baby it. It is tough. Okay, so this is going to be, I'm checking time, this is going to be our last simple example, and it is oversimplified. And I'll talk about that on the upping your game slide, why this is potentially a little oversimplified. But I thought it was fun. So this is just creating a pollinator garden out of one genus, right? So if you were specifically focused on a particular type of bee, the tubes of phlox do very well for long-tongued bees. And there are species of phlox that support all the way from April to August. So if you only wanted to grow one type of plant, you could have a pollinator garden, right? Specifically for this particular plant, it's one of my favorites. I had this photograph before of the spice bush swallowtail on phlox. It is a highly historic plant, which always hits my buttons. It's also very low maintenance, and I love bringing it in for bouquets because it has a really nice scent. If you want to do research on particular types of phlox that you want to bring into your garden, I always recommend plant trials and pulling the data from those, because then you don't have to create a plant trial in your own garden. You don't have to purchase all the duds and then see them not do well and then, you know, select down to a good plant. So Mount Cuba, I'm sure many of you are familiar. It's a native plant center in Delaware. So it's in the mid-Atlantic. So a lot of their plant trial findings are very applicable to Virginia. The Chicago Botanic Garden also does a number of plant trials. Because their weather is somewhat dissimilar from ours, I tend to use it as an initial indicator, but I also know that Mount Cuba's weather is more similar to ours. And then North Carolina State also, because they're in a similar zone from a gardening perspective, their information is very helpful. And again, some of those website addresses will be on your resource sheet. Just quickly, these are some phlox that I have in my Central Virginia garden, so I feel comfortable recommending them. They are certainly not the only choices, but if you're looking for a Divardica, which is going to bloom in April, May Breeze has done very well. Here I have it next to a very non-native hosta, but it is a great pollinator draw, and it does have that color echo with the white, so that's nice. This is a Phlox maculata. I like the pink and white pinwheel effect. It's just fun. And it does very well for bees. It's a little bit earlier in the season in May. So again, you have the Divardica in April, you have the maculata in May. Then your paniculatas, your taller garden phlox, are going to come on a little bit later in June and July. Robert Poor and David, for me, have been mildew free. I know some folks are concerned with phlox that you might have some mildew. These two get no babying whatsoever, and they do well for me. So hopefully they would be a good thing to try in your garden. But ultimately, whatever native plants you want to try, whether you want them named after Virginia or phlox or low maintenance, what I would encourage you to do is just take some time, and really a good first step is to do an initial inventory in your garden. Create a spreadsheet like this. It doesn't take much. You can do it on a pad of paper. It doesn't have to be an Excel or anything. And just take an inventory of what you currently have. And so you know where you might have some holes. So for a number of years in my garden, I've been really heavy in that June, July, August timeframe. And I do great with the echinaceas and the goldenrods and asters, but I was pretty light in the spring. I don't know why. I think, you know, I was just choosing plants that I liked how they looked. And for some reason, I was pretty light in spring blooms. And of course, that's when you're pulling in your pollinators, right? You want them to establish nests in your landscape. And so you really need to stock your shelves in April and May, so you're pulling in those pollinators. And, you know, I've tried to, over the last few years, really focus on that April, May timeframe and up my bloom count during that period of time. You may have the opposite effect in your garden. If you do a current inventory, it may be that you're heavier in spring and you need to kind of beef up the end of the season. But it's a really interesting, really good exercise to do in your own garden, and it helps you decide what you want to add. If you are concerned about the ornamental component of this, again, this talk is supposed to be about melding that ornamental and pollinator-friendly garden. There's an opportunity to kind of look at your color scheme in the same type of chart. You can, you know, this is representative of my garden. For some reason, I have very hot colors in the spring and I go pastel in the fall, and that's okay. Because again, you don't have that conflict between the colors because it changes over the season and you kind of get both color schemes if you're interested in that, or you could be more consistent throughout. But again, I find a bloom chart like this super helpful. One thing I will say about bloom charts, I'm just checking my time here. One thing I will say about bloom charts is when you go to look up plants on the Missouri Botanical Garden or any other website that you're interested in, the Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center in Texas is a great website. That's on your resource sheet. They will tell you that a plant blooms June, July, or a plant blooms April, May, and you will think, I have never had a plant in my garden that has bloomed for 2 full months. And it's true, but here's the reason why they give you that information. And one of the reasons why I will recommend redundancy in your garden. We'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. This is data from Longwood Gardens outside Kennett Square in Pennsylvania. If you haven't been there, please get in your car. No, not right now. In the spring, get in your car and drive to southeastern Pennsylvania and go to Longwood Gardens. It is a 1,000-acre botanical garden. It is magnificent. I did not appreciate. I grew up about 15 minutes away from it, and I thought everybody had a 1,000-acre botanical garden. but you should go. Anyway, this is data from Longwood Gardens. They tracked Mertensia virginica, that bluebell plant, over, 20 years, 1999 to 2018. And they marked down when it bloomed every year. And if you have the patience, if you want to do this in your own garden, it's actually very helpful because blooms vary season to season and you can get a feel for when something actually blooms in your garden. Myself and my neighbor, we have 2 different microclimates, and my bluebells typically bloom a week and a half before his. So anyway, but you look at this chart and you look at the variability, right? So these are horticulturalists who've been tracking this. And at Longwood Gardens, bluebells in 2017 were blooming in March, and in 2014 were blooming in June. So that is why, that variability is why when you look at these sources, they will tell you something is blooming over a 2-month span. It's not that it's going to bloom for the entire 2-month span. It's that it may bloom anytime during that period, depending on the weather and what else is going on. So because of that, we're going to transition into upping your game. But I would also say, even at the very early stages of getting into pollinator gardening, if you could please plant redundant series of native plants, that's really helpful for pollinators because we all have crop failures, right? We all have, I was at a talk that the gentleman who runs the Charlotte Botanical Garden was at. He was talking about they had an infestation of bunnies one year. It was the first time they ever had that happen. And they lost a whole swath of their Rebecchias because it was very appealing apparently to their particular bunny population. And so you will have crop failures, weather related, wildlife related, whatever the case may be. So if you can overlap your projected bloom periods, that's extremely helpful to pollinators. Diversity. So the name of this talk, I think when we put it out there, was Plant 7 Native Plants for 6 months of bloom. Well, guess what? I was wrong. You really should focus on at least 8 native species. And here's the information that came out. So Dr. Gordon Franklin, he is a professor at the University of California. He did some really good work on studying diversity in plant choices and how that affected native pollinators. And I don't have the chart in here. I'm actually going to have it in a talk at Spring Garden Fest. But what he showed is there is a tipping point. So his pollinator diversity at 8 species, right? So I named this talk 7 species and I was like 1 short. At 8 native species in your landscape, it was an exponential increase in the diversity of your pollinators and the number and type of pollinators that you had. And then it gradually increased up to 20 species, and then it flatlined. So you are absolutely welcome to have more than 20 native plant species in your landscape, and I applaud you if you do. But if you can get to 8, that is a tipping point. And then again, it increases up to 20, and then it kind of flatlines. So that's from Dr. Gordon Franklin at the University of California. And then we've already talked about the different flower shapes and how that helps different pollinators. Another way of upping your game, and we are getting close to the end here, is providing nesting sites. So 70% of our native bees are ground nesting. They need bare ground to create a nest. And I know bare ground in a garden sometimes feels uncomfortable, but if you can just leave some bare ground for those native bees. And then finally, really important, and I didn't want to overemphasize this during this talk because if we make it too complicated, people won't take the first step. But if you have the opportunity to select host plants, again, on your resource sheet, it'll talk about the host plants. A host plant is a plant that a caterpillar can eat, right? So you're basically creating a nursery. You're allowing these pollinators to procreate. Because if you just have nectar and pollen, but you don't have host plants, they can't reproduce and have baby caterpillars, right? So think about your host plants. And then finally, if you really want to go for the gold, if you can consider keystone plants. And that's a whole nother talk unto itself, but Dr. Chalamy has done some work on keystone plants. About 5% of our native plants support 75% of those caterpillars. And if you get a chance to plant some keystone plants, it's hugely helpful. Those keystone plants are oak, cherry, willow. So pussy willows are awesome. Birch, and then for smaller gardens, it would be goldenrod, aster, and helianthus, so sunflowers. But that's a goal, right? The first step is to plant some native plants and to try and create that season-long bloom. And then if you can take the next step and do some of these other practices, you're just moving forward and supporting the pollinators even more, while at the same time being highly ornamental. So I'm going to wrap up here. We are 1 minute to go. I told Susan I would try and keep it tight, but for anyone who can stay and discuss their favorite plant, that would be great. But what I would love for you to walk away with is that this can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. And please don't be intimidated. Please take the first step. And if you are in a situation where an ornamental garden or a more traditional garden design is more feasible for you than that meadow design, you can still have an outstanding pollinator garden. So at this point, are there any questions or comments, things that people want to add? I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, we have nothing in the chat box, but I would urge folks, if they have a question or a comment, go ahead and unmute yourself at this point and let's discuss.
Okay, I have a question.
Sure.
I wrote some things in the chat box and I see them on my end, but I guess you guys aren't getting them. But you talk a lot about phlox.
Mm-hmm.
I'm only familiar with the short kind of phlox that spreads and that you plant in rocky areas.
Okay.
So talk to me about tall phlox. Is it easy to grow for a beginner gardener?
Yes, I think so. Other people should bring in their opinions as well. So the creeping phlox that you're talking about is Phlox subulata. It is, that is very easy to grow. I love Phlox subulata. The taller phlox that I was talking about, there's a couple of kinds. So Phlox divardica is also called woodland phlox. It's anywhere from 12 to 18 inches. It likes a little bit of shade here in Virginia, but it doesn't have to have a lot of shade.
Mhm.
And it's earlier in the year. So your Phlox subulata is going to be very early spring. Divardica is going to come in, and for me, it comes in April. I find it very easy to grow.
Okay.
And then maculata in May, that is probably that same height, like 18 to 24 inches. It has thin leaves, so it doesn't really have any powdery mildew problems. And then you move into the Phlox paniculata, which is going to be tall, right? That's going to be anywhere from, I have plants that are 5 feet tall, but there are some that are 3 feet tall. They're great for the middle to the back of the border. I find them very easy to grow. I will tell you that if in certain circumstances, high humidity, if you have certain species, you may get some powdery mildew.
Okay.
And that's why I recommended the Robert Poor and the David, because they're bred to be mildew resistant.
And you would direct sow these and not start from seed in a greenhouse? You would direct sow them?
I have never direct sowed them. I don't know if anyone on the call has. I have bought them as plugs because they're such vigorous growers that once you sort of plant your plugs, like the picture that I showed with that big set of phlox, that was 3 plants.
Wow.
And it fills in, but it's not invasive. I mean, it's not a thug.
Okay.
It's clump forming. So I have never started it from seed. Has anybody on the call ever started phlox from seed?
No.
No. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Kathy, Tess asked, where are good places to get native plants?
No, start at 6.
I'm going to list several because as a master gardener, I'm not supposed to commercially support any particular one seller. So I'm going to list a ton, okay? And you can start with Monticello. Monticello has a plant center, the Thomas Jefferson Plant Center. I may be mispronouncing that, but they just started their bare root sales a couple weeks ago, and they'll start shipping plants in March and April. But they grow them at Monticello at their plant center, and they're a great source. I've gotten a lot of bluebells from them, and I love them. If you're interested in looking at woodies, like shrubs and trees, I've had good luck at Colesville Nursery. If you go to the Colesville site, I mean, not right now because it's January, but if you go to the Colesville site during the growing season and go to their availability list, they actually have a PDF availability list of only native plants, and it is 10 or 12 pages long. It's an Excel spreadsheet that goes on and on and on. It's very bad for your wallet, but it is a really nice selection of native plants. Also, the Virginia Native Plant Society, vnps.org, they typically have plant sales in the spring and in the fall, and they typically have great prices. Oh, I have to plug us. The GPMGA at our plant sale and on April 29th, we'll have native plants. And you can find native plants at, normal nurseries. And it actually is helpful to ask for them because the more you ask for native plants, the more likely those regular nurseries are going to bring them into inventory, right? I mean, they're a for-profit business, right? So if you're saying you're going to buy them, they'll bring them in. But those places should get you started. Oh, one more. I hate to tell you about this one because she sells out, and I don't want her to sell out before I get my plants. But thepollination.org. So ThePollenNation.org, or not .org, .com. She sells plugs. It's the, she sells native plant plugs. It's the only thing she sells. You have to buy them in bunches of 5 because she believes that you need to plant a community of plants. But I'm not going to argue with her because I believe that too. But she sells plugs, so they're somewhat inexpensive. So I hate to do mail order because I don't like to pay shipping, and I think they're really expensive. But she sells plugs, so they're less expensive. And if you do the minimum order, there is no shipping fee. She does not have anything up right now. She starts in February. So go in February and look at the pollination.com. Okay.
I can add one. Reedy Creek Environmental is
Okay.
a small grower in Richmond who only uses local ecotype. So he will
Oh, even
tell
better.
you where he has sourced the various plants he has.
Okay, that's even better if it's local ecotype. Could you spell Reedy for me?
Yeah, REEDY,
Okay.
Reedy Creek Environmental.
Okay, great.
He has a website. You can.
He has a website. Okay, good. Good. I will Google that. Thank you. Anybody else?
Kathy J. Steele has offered these comments. Favorite plants that do well in my yard: native honeysuckle, loves the fence. Bee balm reseeds well, but is picky about shade versus sun.
Yeah.
Native beauty berry, big patch of black-eyed Susans. Trying to start milkweeds, takes a long time to establish a good patch. Have
Yeah.
patches of sea oats grass, not sure if native.
I am not a good grasses person. There's a guy, John, in the Master Gardener group, he's a grass genius. So if you, I apologize, I'm not good with grasses, but I do have a question about your native honeysuckle. So I'm growing Lonicera sempervirens John Wheeler, and I've had sort of minimal bloom. Any thoughts on things you do to make your native honeysuckle happy?
Kathy, I've got some native honeysuckle that is a volunteer, and I've got it in 3 different places. I do absolutely nothing to it, and it seems to be taking off rather well.
Okay.
But I don't do a thing.
Okay.
Yeah, just to weigh in, because I'm Judy Steele, and I posted that. I don't really know what exactly what kind of, I think I got it from the native plant lady that comes to the Ashland Farmers Market, and it started out as a little twig, and it took a long time, but once it started, it just went wild, and it's all over my fence, and it blooms like all the time. It's just really, really robust, but it's a native.
Yes. Yeah. Lonicera sempervirens. I know that, you know, honeysuckles overall have gotten such a bad name because of the invasive Asian types. But that one native type is supposed to be fantastic for hummingbirds. And maybe I'm just being impatient. I've just had it in 1 year. So you said it took it a little while. I'm gonna be patient. And then I'm gonna call you if I can't get it going. Because I'm excited about it. I love hummingbirds. Anybody else have any plant recommendations or anything they think would be helpful for the group?
While people may be thinking about questions, let me just address some of the chat comments. People are asking about this resource list, Kathy. And on Monday, if you could go to the library website, which is pamunkeylibrary.org. From the homepage, you have a couple choices. You can click on the adults icon or the YouTube channel shortcut, and on there you will see a link so that you can view and print out her resource pages, which will be quite helpful.
This is Robin. I learned a while ago about sleep, creep, leap, which really helps me because when you first plant your natives, they're going to sleep and nothing's happening. And then the second year they start like, okay, I'll maybe put out a couple of leaves. And then the third year they go crazy. So I think native gardening is very good to teach patience.
That's probably very true.
Okay,
I
well,
do have-
Kathy, I'd like to thank you so much for your informative educational presentation. Thank you for the time you took today. And don't forget about the handout page, and also don't forget the library has great resources for gardeners in its branches and through its digital library. I'd like to thank the participants all for joining us today and spending part of their Saturday with us. I'd like to mention that our next program will be in person on Saturday, March 11th at 10 a.m., the Goochland branch. The Master Gardeners will offer Garden with Hope from the Soil Up. And I think Audrey would like to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would actually. We've done it once in Powhatan. The Hope Project is kind of a subcommittee of our Master Gardener group, and it stands for Helping Our Planet Endure. So it's right up this alley, so to speak. What we do at the soil event is there's a short presentation, and I emphasize short, and then we move into looking at various components of soil, such as composting, soil drenches, making your own fertilizer from organic materials. I'm trying to remember what else we have. Leaf mulch and other types of mulching. It's really informative. We have it's very informal as well, so it is a little different than this this setting. So I urge everyone to come. It's free, and it from 10, and it actually goes over. It went over last time. I think we finished around 12 actually, because folks had so many questions and comments and wanted to participate so much. It's a great way to really get your hands dirty, maybe not literally, in the soil.
Okay, any other comments? Or Kathy, did you have anything else in closing?
No, I just really appreciate everybody spending the time.
Okay, well, thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you on March 11th at 10 a.m. at the Goochland Branch Library. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.